Jack Bros was released for the Virtual Boy in Japan back in 1995 before making its way over to the West just a few months later. Funnily enough, this was actually the first megaten game to be released outside of Japan. Due to its tragic fate of being released on a failed portable system, along with a very limited run, Jack Bros almost immediately fell into obscurity. Over the years, however, the game has slowly been gaining more recognition. This is mostly to do with the jokes and memes surrounding the game rather than anything to do with the actual product in question. It's how I, and probably many of you, were exposed to this game to begin with. Despite its current status, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who's actually sunk in any amount of time into this title. Recently, I decided to take a shot at the game myself and ended up having a few things I wanted to talk about. So for today, I want to take some time out of your day to tell you why I believe this game is an underrated gem that deserves more attention than just being a simple joke. To quickly address the elephant in the room, I had to rely on emulation in order to get footage for this video. I'm usually against doing this, but since this is a rare game that was released on a failed console from the 90s that doesn't have any sort of video output, I think I can make an exception. So, with that out of the way, let's see what the tale of Jack Bros has in store for us. The game takes place on Halloween night. It's the only time of the year where fairies are able to visit the human world, where they spend their time causing trouble with the local kids. All is well until we find out that our lovable Jack Frost has stayed in the human world for a bit too long. You see, once the clock strikes midnight, any fairy that hasn't returned home will be turned into dust. It's currently 11 PM, so that means Jack Frost has to hurry home before midnight. But thankfully, he has a pixie companion with him to help guide his way back home. That's pretty much all the story that there is to Jack Bros, and it's pretty inconsequential overall. Not that I was expecting anything amazing, but I'm kinda surprised that the story set up here actually justifies the main gimmick of the game. To put it bluntly, Jack Bros is a game that's all about time management. Its core design lends itself well to replayability due to its short length, and it's honestly pretty addicting to just blast through. To get the core mechanics out of the way, you play as one of 3 Jack brothers on their journey through 6 stages. The game plays like a top-down dungeon crawler mixed with a twin-stick shooter. The goal of every stage is pretty simple. You need to reach the bottom of the level and defeat the boss before the timer in the upper corner runs out. Instead of having a traditional health bar, Jack Bros opts to tie your health to an in-level timer. Whenever you receive damage, a certain amount of time will be subtracted depending on what hurt you. You can lose as little to 5 seconds all the way up to half a minute, which can be very devastating. There are no in-level checkpoints, so if you bite the bullet right at the end of the stage, you're going to have to go through it again. This doesn't mean that the odds are completely stacked against you, as there are a few power-ups you can find that can help even the odds. These range from getting a shield that can absorb a few attacks for you, pickups that give you extra time, and even brief invincibility that doubles as a speed boost. Each Jack has their own unique playstyle and special attacks to keep them distinguished. The homeboy himself is the quickest on his feet and can fire projectiles faster than the rest, but has the downside of dealing out the least amount of damage. By consuming one of the stars at the bottom of the screen, your character will activate their special attack. In Jack Frost's case, he does a screen-wide ice attack that freezes all enemies in place. This move is pretty decent to use while you're in a pinch, or if you want to get some free shots in. I'd say that Jack Frost is probably the worst character in the game for a few reasons. His special attack doesn't do a whole lot of damage on its own, and the freezing status doesn't work on boss fights. It's still worth using the attacks because you have a brief moment to get your bearings together, but other than that, it's the worst one in the game in my opinion. Jack Frost has a pretty good fire rate, but I personally think that his attack output is too weak to justify me picking him over the other 2 characters. Jack Lantern strikes a balance between speed and power. His main attack is a fireball that does pretty decent damage, but at the cost of a slower fire rate. Jack Lantern's special attack has him do a screen-wide fire blast that does pretty good damage, but lacks any sort of extra effects like Jack Frost. I'd say that Jack Lantern is my favorite Jack Bro in the game because he fixes the main issues I have with Jack Frost while still keeping projectile-based attacks. The last Jack we have access to is a bit of an odd case. This is Jack Skelton, but in the Japanese version of the game, he's known as Jack the Ripper, and because that name is far better in my eyes, I'll be referring to him as that for the rest of the video. Unlike the other Jacks, Jack the Ripper is a melee-based fighter. He wields a knife that, while short-range, packs one hell of a punch. Jack the Ripper's special attack, much like the others, is a full-screen nuke. I just find this to be a better version of Jack Lantern's special attack because they have the same function, yet Jack the Ripper's does more damage. You can absolutely melt certain enemies and early bosses if you play your cards right. The only 2 flaws this character has is that you need to put yourself in harm's way to deal damage. He's also the slowest of the 3 brothers, making certain enemies harder to kill with him. Jack the Ripper can be classified as a high-risk, high-reward character. Skilled players are the people who will get the most use out of him, since his damage output is so high. But getting hit by attacks in Jack Bros is very detrimental because your health is linked to the time limit you have to complete the stage. Since there's touch damage in this game, you need to be pretty cautious while using Jack the Ripper because his range is very short. While the characters have distinctions from each other, I wouldn't say that picking Jack the Ripper over Jack Frost offers an entirely different experience. Your playstyle is altered slightly, but the level design and obstacles remain the same across all characters. If you beat the game with one Jack, then you most likely can do it with the rest. Jack Bros, at the end of the day, is a very simple game to describe, but something that I want to cover is the general level design itself and the obstacles that you need to overcome. Almost every stage introduces a new enemy or hazard that you need to watch out for, so it's a very smooth difficulty curve. Almost every floor in the game has a certain amount of keys that you need to collect in order to descend further. These keys can either be sitting in plain sight or will be held by specific enemies you need to kill. The first stage of the game only has 3 floors, but as the game goes on, the levels become larger and more complex. New obstacles are slowly introduced to help keep things fresh, ranging from new types of enemies to environmental hazards. Combine this with a very strict starting time, this makes Jack Brothers a pretty tricky game to finish the first time around. It was around stage 5 when I hit my first major roadblock. By this point, the length of each individual floor has increased substantially. There's also the fact that the Cyclops enemy is introduced in this stage too. This guy is a bit of an asshole, because not only does he have the most HP of any standard enemy and can deal out some decent damage to the Jacks, but his main gimmick is that after he takes a few steps, your character will momentarily freeze in place. This may not sound bad on paper, but in a game where time management is integral, it gets pretty frustrating. This will happen no matter where you are on the floor. As long as a Cyclops is on the same floor as you, you will be stunned every few seconds. It's at this point in the game where you're going to have to plan out your routes to be as efficient as possible. Jack Bros is a game where trial and error is used as a learning tool. It's unlikely that you'll finish the second half of the game without running out of time at least once, and that's okay. There is no punishment for dying other than restarting the stage, where you can use your newfound knowledge of the stage to blast through it without too much trouble. It may sound as though I like this game quite a bit, and for the most part that's true, but sadly there are a few weak points here that keep me from going back to Jack Bros often. I find the boss battles kind of whack in this game. The first 2 aren't so bad. They're just bigger enemies that can shoot projectiles at you. Things start to get a tad annoying with the boss against the vampire. This is where these encounters start to have more gimmicks thrown into the mix. In this fight, the floor is constantly moving to the left and right while Vampire attacks you with his bats. It's not super difficult to deal with, but it can get a tad irritating when all your shots either miss or hit the wrong target. The last 3 bosses in the game gave me a lot of shit and were the main cause of game overs for me. It was a combination of a few things. My first playthrough of the game was with Jack Frost, who isn't exactly good with boss battles. His low damage output really rears its head on these later battles. I was doing so little damage with my normal and special attacks that I would just run out of time before I could land the final blow. Jack the Ripper, on the other hand, can tear through bosses with his knife and heavy-hitting special attacks. His biggest downside is that you have to get uncomfortably close to the bosses, meaning that you're most likely going to trade damage. Make sure that you have a lot of time stocked up before entering a boss floor because they can quickly take you down. The final boss in particular was rough with all characters. You see, the final boss fight is against the Lord of the Flies, Beelzebub. Oh, I'm sorry, I mean Beelzebub. Beelzebub here is a 2-phase boss battle where you take down his human form before fighting his fly form. The first phase goes by pretty quick. The second one, however, can get fucked. Look at that health bar. And Jack Frost does so little damage to him that you pretty much have to go into this fight with as much time as possible while at the same time avoiding every attack that comes your way. This also just so happens to be the longest stage in the game, meaning if you bite the bullet here, you're sent back 20 floors and have to try again. As a reminder, there are only 60 floors in the game, meaning that the last level is 1/3 of the entire runtime. Beelzebub's actual attacks are honestly pretty easy to dodge, but it's not the only reason why this boss is hard. These spiked traps on the wall here, known as Paradise, are the true final boss in my eyes. This obstacle is introduced earlier in the game, but they're at their worst here. Standing between 2 Paradise traps cause them to close in on you, dealing a good chunk of damage to your time. The final boss features a set of those alongside Beelzebub's main attacks, so it becomes a balancing act of sorts to find the proper space to stand in order to avoid taking damage. It certainly took me a few attempts to get it down my first playthrough, but it's not too hard as Jack the Ripper because of his insane damage output. When you beat the game with all 3 Jacks, you unlock a code you can input on the title screen to access hard mode. There's also another code you can put in to play as a secret 4th character, Pixie. She's easily the best character in the game, combining all of the best aspects of each Jack into one character. Her special attack is even temporary invincibility. Anyways, I find hard mode to be pretty underwhelming. Nothing about the actual stage design changes, other than the number of enemies you have to deal with and the type you might face. I would have preferred to have a remix level design that could really test your skills. Even a more strict time limit could go a long way in making the stages feel fresh. Maybe my expectations are just too high. I'm not sure how much space is on a Virtual Boy cartridge, so maybe this was the best they could do. But it begs the question of whether or not this needed to be a Virtual Boy game to begin with. I've never used one, but while playing the game through an emulator, I didn't think I was missing out on any features that janky 90s 3D could add. Overall, I enjoyed my time with this game, enough to do 4 full run-throughs. There's a lot of untapped potential here that I think a proper sequel could expand on. I think a Steam release with a level editor could provide Jack Bros with a lot of replayability. After seeing what the community did to Persona 4 when that was released on PC, I could only imagine what they'd do to Jack Bros. Or maybe even a full-fledged sequel that can access all the untapped potential that this formula has. As of right now, it's a solid game with some replayability, but not enough to keep myself going back to it very frequently. I at the very least recommend you try out one full playthrough of Jack Bros. It's not a very long game, only clocking in at about an hour for your first run, but Jack Bros proves itself to be a game worth remembering. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I'd like to give a special shout out to all of my patrons whose names are on screen now. If you enjoy my content and are willing to support me, I encourage you to check out my Patreon in the description below. Every donation makes a difference, plus I have a few things I can give back in return, such as early video access. I'm still working on my video about The World Ends With You, but I had enough free time to get this quick one out for April. I've been trying to improve my workflow so there isn't a large gap between uploads anymore. That is, until I finally get to Persona 5, which I'll start working on sooner than you all think. I'll have more information regarding that in the future, so please follow my Twitter if you're interested in staying up to date. A link to that will be in the description below. So thank you very much for watching, and take care.